Right. Hi, everybody. My name is Mario Caro. I'm the director of the MFA Studio Arts here at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Welcome to the first in the series of public lectures, which are part of the robust programming that we have for the inaugural Summer Institute of the IAIA Master in Fine Arts and Studio Arts. I'm speaking to you from our state-of-the-art broadcasting facility here on campus. I want to thank Jason Ordaz, Nicole Law, and the rest of the crew who are making all of this possible. I also want to thank Dawn Martinez, who's been helping us throughout the week. She is our program coordinator. I should acknowledge that this lovely facility is is located on the traditional lands of the Tewa and Tiwa peoples, who make up 19 pueblos here in what is usually referred to as New Mexico. I'm delighted to introduce you today to Dr. Brett Graham, who is a sculptor, creates large-scale artworks and installations, sometimes monumental in scale. His work explores indigenous histories, politics, and philosophies. Dr. Graham works on and joins us today, although you might have to correct me on that because I just spoke to him and I don't think he is at the Tamaki Makaurau Aotearoa, otherwise known as Auckland, New Zealand. I believe he's somewhere joining us from somewhere else today. He's traveled widely, undertaking residencies throughout the Pacific, North America, and Europe, and including Asia. I understand he's spent some time in Japan at some point. He conceives his Maori whakapapa as Pacifica Moana identity, and affiliated with a global network of indigenous and non-Western peoples. It is from this basis that Graham's work engages with histories of imperialism and global indigenous issues. I'm delighted that he's joined us today. I know this is a challenging time for him on a variety of fronts, so I'm very grateful and I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Graham.
Morning or afternoon.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share the PowerPoint that goes along with this presentation, and he will cue me when I need to proceed.
You can hear me, Mario?
I can hear you fine. I'm not sure if he's on. Great. Loud and clear.
Morena tātou. Taku mihi atu tēnei kia koutou katoa noho tāwhiti ana. It's a great privilege to be the first of your speakers in this series. You can hear me, eh?
Yes.
Thanks, Mario. I have to apologize for my New Zealand accent, so if you can't understand anything, please let me know. Should I go ahead?
Yeah, please.
So it's great to be able to join you today, and Mario's put this challenge to talk about the avant-garde in relationship to Indigenous artists, and I was thinking about it, and for Indigenous people who don't have a linear sense of time, or don't believe in this arrow of time going forwards and backwards, or then the notion of an avant-garde in some ways doesn't make sense. Anyway, the title of the talk is Kia haere whakamua, me haere whakamuri, which means to go backwards, we must go, to go forwards, we must go backwards. So in the light of that discussion of the avant-garde, I've just been intrigued, as I say, by the way Indigenous people view time and don't necessarily see time as this progression. So recently we've been exploring the notion that time is actually not a line forward, but a spiral. And so you're always conscious of the past and the future. So with that in mind, I thought we'd look at two exhibitions that occurred over the summer. One called Toi Tu Toi Ora. Thanks, Mario. You can show the next slide if you like. So the first show that I thought we could look at was Toi Tu Toi Ora, which was a major show at the Auckland City Art Gallery that was curated by Nigel Burrell. And Toi Tu Toi Ora comes from a saying that that art or toi gives us life, and art makes us proud. It comes from an ancestral saying, toi tupu toi ora whanake te toi ahua mai iho waiki, which means that toi has life-giving properties. Toi is growth, and art or toi or art is growth, and that we advance through toi, and that toi is a gift that comes from our ancestors from Hawaii. Thank you, Mario. Next image. So Toi Tu Toi Ora is interesting in that the Auckland City Art Gallery is one of the biggest art galleries in the country. It has had an Indigenous curator or two Indigenous curators, Ngahi Raka Mason, and in the last 5 years, Nigel Burrell. The show, or the Auckland City Art Gallery, has had maybe two other collective Māori shows in its history, and there's been a 20-year gap since the last exhibition. So the show was sort of eagerly awaited. There's great anticipation around this exhibition. It's unusual in that it was granted 3 floors of the Auckland City Art Gallery. So this is very generous in regards to the Auckland City Gallery. Have never done this before. Nigel has tried to keep to a Māori worldview in his conceptualization of the show. So there's 3 sections that relate to the creation story. So the first section is Te Kore, and then it goes, Te Kore means the unfathomable void, if you like, and it's the time before anything was created. It's a time of potential. And then it goes into Te Po, which is the night, and then the last section is Te Ao Marama, which means the coming into the light, if you like, the world of light. So he's tried very hard to keep to this conceptual framework and not have a show that addresses those usual concerns of colonization. But of course, it's impossible to have an exhibition without those kind of references. So the first section is all black. You go in and it's black and it's sort of mysterious, and it's Te Kore. And this is the work that sort of exemplifies that. This is by Peter Robinson. Peter Robinson exhibited at the Venice Biennale, and this work comes from that time. So this is from 20 years ago. And images like this sort of suggest this binary code of ones and O's are sort of a reference to Te Kore, or nothingness, the time before the night. It's also interesting from a Māori perspective because I and O make this word Eo, and Eo was seen as the supreme being, or the god that was superior to all other gods. So it's very different, as you can imagine, seeing work like this from its original context in the Venice Biennale. Thank you, Mario. So this is a work by Lisa Rehana. It's the creation myth. It's interesting that she's used that word myth. So Lisa Rehana is another prominent artist. This is actually in the Tapor section. So the idea of the period of Te Kore or nothingness, which goes into Tapor, or the period of darkness, and then in Te Ao Marama, or the world of light, comes from the creation origin story of the two primal parents, Rangi and Papa, Sky Father and Mother Earth, and they're locked in an internal embrace. And then their children, the gods, like Tane, the god of the forest, Tawhiri Mātea, the god of the wind, Tangaroa, the god of the sea, decide to separate their parents. And by separating them, light comes into the world because they're growing in the space between heaven and earth. So she's alluding to that. So this appears on a 6-meter screen, a large screen, where she's exploring that origin story. Thank you, Mari. Works like this, she did a series before called Digital Marae, and this relates to this. This is an auntie of hers, I think, and the title is Mahuika. Mahuika is the fire goddess who is challenged by our trickster isn't a coyote because we don't have coyotes, but our trickster is called Maui Tiki Tiki a Taranga. And he's a figure that is prominent throughout Polynesia, Hawaii, the other Polynesian islands. Anyway, Maui approaches Mahuika and for the gift of fire, and she does so by giving him one of his fingernails. And by that, he can light the fire. So that's why she's holding up a hand like that. But anyway, he's a trickster. So he drops the fingernail and extinguishes the fire, and then he goes back to ask for another fingernail. And he actually does this 10 times until she's exhausted all the fingernails, goes into a rage, and she throws the last fingernail down, and the entire world catches fire until it's eventually contained by Maui in a tree, which by rubbing sticks of these trees together, we attain fire again. But anyway, she's contemporized the image and again made it relevant to our own family by using her auntie as the subject matter. Thanks, Maria. So anyway, they're the sort of works that are included in this show. So he's very conscious of that creation story, and again, deliberately trying to avoid those narratives about colonization and context and so on that our art's usually immersed in. And then we've gone back. This section again is another shot of Te Po, the nighttime. It has 2 works, one by Israel Tangaroa Birch, and then another work by Bob Yonke. So again, it's relating to something that is in the distant past, and yet he's utilized these very contemporary media. In this case, that work by Israel, but also the neon works by Bob Yonke. Thank you. Oh no, yeah. And then you burst into Te Ao Marama, the world of light. And this is an installation by Mata Aho, so there's 4 women, young women who've just come out of art school, who have a history of making these wonderful installations and working collaboratively. In their short time, they've been to Documenta. They were in Aquabud last year or 2 years ago. And and now they've presented this work, which actually relates to Hine Nui Te Po, the goddess of death, and another creation narrative. It's quite a beautiful work. It's made out of a series of screens that recede, and you look through into the space, which suggests Hine Nui Te Po, or the night. And it's got contemporary references as well. So it's actually, ironically, that rectangular pattern is was named after the shape of a fly swat, and that material, that screening material, is used as a fly screen or a bug screen. Thanks, Mario. And then, so in keeping with the way Māori exhibitions have occurred since the beginning of what they called Māori artists and writers in the 1970s, you'll have students alongside the masters. So this is an interpretation on the windows of a work by Sandy Adset, he's in his 80s now, but he's a prominent Māori artist that is having a major exhibition soon in a gallery in Wellington. So he's an artist that's looked at kōwhaiwhai design, or elements of painting that were originally on the architecture of the meeting house, and done contemporary versions of those. Thanks, Mario. And it's kind of a survey show as well. So there's works, as I say, by prominent artists. It's a very democratic show. He's tried to address many of the sins of the fathers, if you like. This is Ngā Mōrehu, which is a large ceramic installation that shows the woman in the act of karanga, or calling people onto the marae. But in this case, they're calling to a young girl. So Ngā Mōrehu means the survivors. It's a very well-known piece that was done in the 90s, I think. And so they're actually calling out to the girl, and in view of all the tragic statistics to do with Māori women, they're addressing some of those hardships specifically to the girl. And the words of the karanga, or the call, are written on their bodies. So it's ceramic, a large work. And again, this is in a section of mainly women. 60% of the exhibition are women. And so, as I say, he's trying to address the sins of his fathers, the last generation, where in shows like Kohia ko Taikaka Anake, or Gather the Heartwood, the main installations were all by men, and they received a lot of criticism for that. Thanks, Murray. This is another work by Peter Robertson. So Nigel's tried to take liberties with the exhibition, which are interesting. So in the one section of the art gallery that has a lot of European paintings, Renaissance paintings, works by masters and so on, he's incorporated a lot of Māori works to talk about that challenge of Indigenous art to the traditional narrative about Western art being superior. So this work, for example, is by Peter Robinson. It comes from the 90s, Boy Am I Scared. It originally comes, or that title, Boy Am I Scared, was originally a reference to a painting by a famous Pākehā white artist called Colin McCann with the same title. And it was done in response to a photograph of two Māori youths peering into an art gallery, sort of being afraid of and questioning whether they are entitled to go into this place. So this is a version of that 20 years on in relation to those European paintings. And then the image there is sort of a large spiral. And so he's sort of parodying the symbolism of the main museum in the country, which is called Te Papa, or ironically, Our Place, which is the sort of all-embracing, inclusive notion that the art gallery is for everybody, to popularize the museum. But of course, museums have that history of being for the elite. Thanks, Mario. commissions, and this is by Shane Cotton, a large commission on a public building in a very prominent place in Auckland. So these are all vessels and they have mighty designs on them. They go right back to the start of Shane Cotton's career. He's the artist, if you like, where he was looking at imagery like this. He's referring to Mopai, which was done in a sort of transition period, or people will talk about a naive period of Māori art, where they were, rather than carving and weaving and decorating their meeting houses in a traditional way, they started to look at Western picture books and were very influenced by Western imagery. And however, the pot plant, so there are a lot of pot plants with plants rather than traditional ways of depicting plants. However, they weren't so innocent. They all related to statements by a Māori prophet or leader called Te Koti, who made a lot of statements about preserving your land or holding on to the land. And the depiction of a pot plant was one way of talking about the preservation of land. Thanks, Mario. Go ahead and read that if you like. The interesting thing about Toi Tu Toi Ora is the publicity that it received. So it was talked about as being this landmark exhibition, but ironically, the curator resigned before the opening of the exhibition. And it caused quite a controversy, quite a stir, because seemingly the art gallery had been most generous in providing 3 floors for this exhibition, but at the same time, the curator had sort of had enough, was fed up. And he often mentioned about how he couldn't work with this colonial regime. So despite the publicity of the show, the great publicity for the show, all of this transpired as well. Thanks, Mario. Yeah, so that was the major group show over the summer. And I suppose I'm getting old now, and it's sort of one of a series of shows that I've seen at the art gallery I've been involved in. But what struck me the most was the way the rangatahi or Māori youth talked about that show, because growing up in urban cities, growing up in city environments and so on, they, this was their moment. This was their moment where they could be part of this collective or this narrative about Māori art. So when I read all those comments, I sort of realized how important it was for them to stamp their identity on the city and to feel part of something. So running concurrently was an exhibition of mine in another part of the country, in New Plymouth in Taranaki, which is about 5 hours from Auckland and 5 hours from Wellington, the 2 biggest cities in the North Island. And this exhibition was called Tai Moana Tai Tangata. So I was I was an artist in residence in New Plymouth, which is a sort of smallish city in New Zealand, resident there in November 2018. And this exhibition was my response. Tai Moana Tai Tangata itself refers to a dialogue from the 18th century, 19th century, the 1830s, where a prominent chief called Te Rauparaha said to an enemy, ka pare te tai moana, ka timu te tai tangata, which means when the sea recedes, when the tide of the ocean rises, the tide of humanity recedes, which seems particularly pertinent for me in this time of global warming. Thank you, Mario. So I was very interested in the connections between my tribe of Tainui and this area of Taranaki, where this exhibition was to be held. So the two tribes of Tainui and Taranaki have the greatest history of land confiscation. So there was 1.4 million acres confiscated from Taranaki, outright confiscation, and 1.2 million acres confiscated from Tainui in the 1860s. And of course, without the land, these tribes became essentially, well, landless. And the effects that have been ongoing, of course, have gone through generations. A lot of the land after that was confiscated by the land courts, by sort of shady deals with the land courts. But as far as outright confiscations, these were the tribes that were penalized the most. Anyway, the exhibition, I was invited along after a series of PR disasters by this gallery. Oh, gee, I don't know if I should say that, if this is being recorded. But anyway, the director had, as part of a commemoration of Captain Cook, who apparently discovered us, he wanted to bring back to Taranaki a series of paintings that were in our National Gallery of Te Papa, including this painting by William Strutt, a view of Egmont, Taranaki, New Zealand. With Maoris driving off settlers' cattle, 1861. So in the painting you see Taranaki, which is the name of the mountain, a prominent landscape feature, and you have Maori who are apparently stealing cattle from the settlers, and this image caused great offence to the kaumātua. The fact that the gallery, as a way of talking about biculturalism, depicted Maori stealing cattle off their own land from the settlers. Next image, please, Mario. And so this quote here is by Peter Moreho, for example, that expressed that that disdain for this painting, that sort of classified Maori as thieves in their own land once again. And so there was great objection to this painting, and so a friend of mine who's a curator, Anna Marie White, who is from Waitara, she's Māori from Taranaki. She suggested that they have an exhibition of mine to sort of address some of these questions. And if you like to heal some of those wounds between not only the council and the art museum and the Māori community, but also look at this history between her tribe and my tribe. Thanks, Mario. If you go to the city, you're constantly, of New Plymouth, you're constantly reminded of those wars, and if you go there as Māori, you're constantly reminded of the fact that the people have been alienated within our own land. So this is just one of many things. A headstone, for example, in a church called St. Mary's, referring to Māori as being the rebels. So, and this cemetery is full of references like that. And inside the church, there's actually flags of the British regiments that came to aid the settlers and fight against Māori when trouble broke out between the settlers and Māori. Thank you. So anyway, I've had a history of engaging with monuments, and for example, these are two monuments, obelisks in the city that I'm now in, Napier, or in Hawke's Bay. So this sort of classifies that, where you've got two monuments that define the history of the town and their history of heroism. But a lot of these monuments were built at the start of First World War as sort of reminders of how people had rallied together to fight a common foe, i.e. Māori, in the past. And this is sort of a mythology in this town about this great battle called Omaru Nui. And so you've got these two monuments there, either side of the town. that talk about how Māori from a different part of the town were going to invade Napier. The local Māori joined with forces with the local militia and defeated this common foe. And there's monuments for that. But they don't tell you the other side of the history, that there's no actual evidence that those people that came here had ill feeling or actually wanted to conduct these acts against this town. There's no evidence at all. In fact, there's some evidence to say that the Minister of Native Affairs actually summoned them here. Anyway, when they arrived in the town, they were surrounded, many of them killed, some imprisoned. And so I was engaged with the way that history had been written about this particular story, and then the evidence by these monuments, and yet there's no actual evidence that they came here with ill intention in mind. Thank you, Mario. Yeah, next image, thanks. So for example, I did my version of those monuments. Property of peace, property of evil. So yeah, the exhibition was peace as a property, evil as a property. It related to when they were surrounded, they were given an ultimatum to leave. A note was sent to them asking what were their intentions. And then this very enigmatic message was sent back by the people inside. They said, he taonga te pai, he taonga te kino, which was translated as peace as a property and evil as a property. So it was making it unclear as to what their intentions were. Anyway, I've sort of reinterpreted that in these two artworks, these two columns that were made out of wood and they were 5 meters tall, but supposed to feel vulnerable and relate to those obelisks that were smashed in protest to that historical narrative that had represented the history of the other side, if you like, of Ngāti Hine Uru. Thank you. And then this was actually a monument to, this is sort of an anti-monument to a heroine within our area of Waikato called Te Puia. After 4 years of celebrating or commemorating battles in from World War I in that period, you know, the last 4 years between 2014 and 2018, you know, everyone had sort of World War I fatigue, if you like. But I thought it might be interesting to make a monument to Te Puia. Te Puia was a prominent leader within Waikato that had refused conscription. Because we'd had this history of land loss only 50 years beforehand, she put her foot down and said, we don't believe in the shedding of blood. We won't send our young men to Europe to fight and die when only 50 years ago you confiscated all our land. So I wanted to build a monument to her, only the shape of it took the form of a redoubt, a European redoubt used to invade our territories. Thank you, Mario. So during the residency, I was lucky enough to spend a month, 8 weeks rather, in Taranaki and engage very much with the local people, including the community of a place called Parihaka. And at Parihaka, it was an example of passive resistance. So after a lot of the people had lost their land during the what they call the land wars or the Māori wars, or in Māori Te Riri Pākehā, a lot of the survivors of these battles gathered in a place called Parihaka under two prophets called Te Whiti and Tohu. And they believed in passive resistance. They could see the futility of resisting the entire weight of the British Army. So so when the soldiers eventually came to their community, they sat down before them on the roadside. First the children, and then the woman, and then the men, and then the elders were inside the heart of the village. And so they just sat down, and in the way that a modern protest would, rather than meet with any sort of force. Thanks, Maria. So anyway, this is this recent exhibition that I've just had, Taiwan and Tai Tangata. So again, I was looking at all the things that's connected Taranaki, their tribe, to Waikato, who prior to this time had been enemies. And yet through the land wars and through a common resistance to the British Army and the invasion, there's been this bond formed between Taranaki and Tainui. And one of the things that's kind of interesting, it's like the Paiute Messiah, if you like, or the ghost shirts and the dancing. There were a lot of millennium cults, if you like, that could see the futility of resisting with violence, as I say, the weight of the British Army. And so a lot of prophetic movements arose, including what we call Pai Marere, that started in Taranaki and spread throughout the country, but has stayed in Waikato, or where I live. So they created these large poles called new poles that they say they were based on ships' masts, and they used to dance around them and pray. And it was a response of looking at these bizarre practices by the British Army, where they would put up a flagpole, hoist a flag, and then salute the flag, and then march around these flagpoles. So Pai Marere was a response to that. They thought if the British Army had spent so much time doing this every morning and in the evenings and ritualizing that process, that there must be some spiritual power with these flagpoles. So Māori began to appropriate a lot of rituals from the British Army, strangely enough, their enemy, such as the toko, the stick that the elders carry, sort of an imitation of the staves the British had, and also dance around these flagpoles. Also like the ghost shirts and the ghost dancing, they would believe if they raised their hands and went into battle, they'd be impervious to the British bullets. So anyway, knowing that history and knowing that Taranaki, these things had been outlawed and never been seen for 150 years, but also the fact that they were carried to Waikato and we still practice these karakia, I wanted to make a new pole. So this is the first thing you saw when you went into the gallery. It stands at 10 meters, what's that, 30 feet in the gallery, and fills a void between spaces. The gallery is unusual in that it's not a white cube. It was an old picture theatre, and so now it's a series of levels, and you go up a staircase and then view art on all of these different levels. Thanks, Maria. The work is carved in a traditional sense with this pattern called whakarare. Thank you. And as I say, it stands 10 meters tall. So the first thing you do is go in and look up. You couldn't help but do that. The title of the work is called Cease Tide of Wrongdoing, and it relates to a treaty claim and an old name in Taranaki called Taiporo Henui, which literally means, was translated as Cease Tide of Wrongdoing. And one translation of that name is in regards to cease the tide of the settlers and their invasion of the land, taking the land, hence the wrongdoing. It has 4 arms, which in this case refer to pataka or storehouses, rather than the arms of the mast. And the storehouses is one way of talking about the wealth of Taranaki. The storehouses were where taonga or precious things were placed. And so it's one way of talking about that wealth of Taranaki and how it's been taken as part of that cease tide of wrongdoing. Thank you, Mario. I should also say that, so at the porphyry or the opening, my tribe came into the gallery, and our tareao, or the priests of these prayers of this particular faith. Instantly walked in, and without me saying anything, we surrounded this new pole and recited those karakia. And they hadn't been heard in Taranaki for 150 years. And this was alluded to during the speeches after. So it was a very important, quite electric moment for our tribe and for Taranaki. In regards to the layering of the gallery, it sort of allowed me to make work where they could have conversations with each other. So above that is this sort of sentinel, which relates to the, as I say, the redoubts, the forts that the British built. They'd claim land and then build these makeshift forts like that. So this work is called Grand Folly Egmont, and also is sort of refers to the prominence of the mountain Taranaki, which dominates the landscape and was renamed Egmont after one of the sponsors of Captain Cook, again, the supposed discoverer of these islands. Thanks, Mario. So in relation to, anyway, because I have to respond to the avant-garde, the way the work is laid out is the traditional notion, if you like, of Māori and a lot of Indigenous societies, the idea that the past, present, and future coexist and surround us constantly. So next to the new pole is a video of a place called Te Namu. Thanks, Mario. Is there another image? So right next to the video is, to the sculpture is this video that's 6 meters long that refers to a place called Te Namu. So this is on the Taranaki coast, and it's where Te Oho Mene, the prophet, had the vision of Paimarere, which is the religion that I referred to. So he had a vision, and an angel came to him, and in this vision, he was responding to a dilemma. There'd recently been a shipwreck at this place called Te Namu, and because there was a state of war, if you like, between Māori and Pākehā at that time, any Pākehā or white people that had entered Māori territory under the law of the Māori king were to be killed. So he was in this dilemma of that, and the fact that because he was missionary raised, of course, the tendency was to save these survivors from the shipwreck. So to live or die, to be under the realm of the god of war or the god of peace, of Tangaroa, of Rongo or Tumatainga. So he created this faith, or he had this vision at that time in response to that dilemma. So anyway, in this video, I'm sort of referring to Te Namu. It has all these layers of history. It was the place where the two tribes had fought, place where Te Ua had this vision. But in regards to the future, because Taranaki is an area where a lot of oil and gas, where the oil and gas industry is quite prominent, and in regards to the climate change and these things that face us now, I had animated a series of these oil derricks placed in that landscape that refer to that history and our possible future if we keep with this tide of wrongdoing. So that's how it related to the new. And the fact that once the settlers arrived and they had this particular mentality that all the resources belong to them, the ongoing effects of that, of course, ultimately will be global warming. Thanks, Mario. And then you would go up the stairs to see the next artwork. But on the steps themselves, I'd placed, I had made this tapestry. So there's a tapestry that goes up the steps, and it's very subtle. In fact, most people, because the space was quite dark, didn't even notice that they were standing on this at first. So it goes up the steps, and it's covered with the flags of those British regiments that fought against those tribes of Taranaki and Tainui. And it has all their regimental numbers. So it's a direct response to the to going into St. Mary's Church and seeing the flags, the British regiments or hatchments as they're called, hung up in that church. And all these constant reminders of who the victor was during the land wars. So you walk up the steps and you're essentially trampling on these flags. So, you know, when I told that to Māori that would come into the gallery, they'd love it and laugh at being able to give that freedom. Thanks, Mario. And then that led to this work called O Pioneer. And have you got another image of that, Mario? Thank you. So O Pioneer is, it sort of looks like a gun turret, and it relates to the gunboats that the New Zealand government had commissioned from Australia that were built to go up the arteries, if you like, the means of communication at that time, the rivers, and then blast the Māori fortifications and communities. So anyway, where I live very close to one of these, and then about an hour's drive south of where I live, there's another one of these. After the wars, these things were dumped in the landscape as reminders of who the victors were, and as memorials. So one of them has been used as a First World War memorial. So ironically, they're talking about all the enemies, if you like, both those hostile Māori and then eventually the Germans or enemies in the First World War. But so these two forms relate to those monuments that exist in my, or not far from my community, if you like. Thank you. Yeah, this is another close-up of Black Shroud. I don't know if you can see it, it's pretty dark, but it was supposed to be quite subtle. And so you've got your British flags there, and you've got the regimental numbers. In Māori, there's the word for walk on is takahi. And so when you talk about someone being punished, or you talk about them being takahi'd, if you like, or not punished, but, well, like in English, being walked over. Thank you. There was so because the building was so unusual, it's got these 5 layers, such a big space, and so disconnected. One way I felt of continuing the story, the narrative of the exhibition, was through these 3 videos that referred to places and took you on a journey from the southern coast up to the northern coast that joins my territory or our landscape. So the next video was called Ohawe and related to another beach in Taranaki. And this place had been the border, if you like, between Pākehā white territory and Māori territory at one time before all of it was taken. So that there was a border there was a redoubt or one of those forts. And it's also the place where my grandfather's father was buried. So we have an unusual family history in that my grandfather's father started a family in Waikato, in Tainui, in my tribal area, and also in Taranaki. So we have these connections through blood with Taranaki. So anyway, he was buried there on the cliffs, but where he was buried, that collapsed into the ocean. And anyway, bring that forward to now, or to this decade, and you've got iron or mining companies that wanted to extract the black sand that's rich in iron ore and take it away to Japan and elsewhere to be used to make steel. So they were protesting about the taking away or extraction of sand. And I was sort of intrigued by the notion that my great-grandfather, their bones would collapse into the ocean, become sand, and then potentially would be taken away to use for mining, as if, literally our ancestors are being taken away and used for profit, to make profit. So this was a video as well, and a shot that went down the coast. Yeah, thank you. And then in the highest point of the gallery, was a work called Maunga Longo ki te whenua, Maunga Longo ki te tangata, which means peace to mankind, peace to the land. Which means basically, if you take care of the welfare of the land, then you take care of the welfare of the people. And so the work it refers to one of those storehouses that I was talking to you about before. In this case, the carving style is taken from the local carving style in a prominent pātaka or storehouse that's in the museum. Only in this case, it's unusual in that I've put it on wheels and turned it into a kind of wagon. So the point of that was in reference to that village, that community I talked about before called Parihaka, this village of passive resistance. And the reason why I put it on wheels was it was sort of a remark about the hospitality of those people. When the British soldiers and surveyors came, the people under the prophets of Te Whiti and Tohu would send out wagons of food. So they did that as a gesture of hospitality, but the underlying message was, under Māori protocols, is that they were the hosts and those people were the visitors, and it was a reminder that they were the visitors. Mm. But of course, and ironically, the surveyors, of course, were there to mark out the land and mark it out before the settlers arrived. So, but of course, the message was far too subtle for them to understand anyway. But so that was one of the ideas behind this work and putting it on wheels. And also, of course, the migratory nature of Māori at that time of great change when settlers first came here and forced them off their lands. The two ends are carved differently in reference to the different responses that Māori had to land, to the coming of the settlers, first with war, with another Māori prophet called Te Tokowaru, and then with peace in regards to Tohu and Whiti and to Te Whiti. Thank you. I don't usually work in a traditional carving style like this or manner, but I just thought it was appropriate for this artwork to tell those stories. So this is just another shot of the work. Thank you, Maria. Yeah, this is another shot of the same work. The last work in the exhibition, as I mentioned before, was this thing that referred to a British fortification, although it's been elongated in reference to the mountain of Taranaki. It's called Grand Folly Egmont, and Egmont was the name given by Captain Cook to Taranaki, the mountain. And so I'm talking about the folly of that, but also a folly or Grand Folly was sort of an architectural feature that British aristocrats would put into their lands as part of their landscaping that essentially was functionless. So they were useless. They had no point. And so I'm referring to that history. And also in our territory, there was a prominent land speculator called Firth, and he built some of these structures that referred to redoubts, but actually were functionless. They were just so that he could bring his friends in from Auckland and thrill them with the idea that Māori could attack them at any time, even though at the time they were built, Māori had been subdued. Thank you. It's supposed to look sinister. it's people's job, of course, to write screeds about artworks and these sort of things. But I believe that the visual language is powerful and that forms can have an effect on the human body. So it done at the scale. So it was supposed to look sinister. It was supposed to look slightly clannish, if you like, in regards to that history of redoubts and the creeping of the settlers into Taranaki land. Thank you. So you see how those embraces take the holes, the loopholes that the people would look out, and if you're inside of one of these forms, would look out into the landscape. So it's the same. They carry the same shape as the films. So this is the third film, and it carries the narrative up to my part of the country. And again, our family history relating to a great grandfather who was buried, whose ship was shipwrecked there, but also prominent shipwrecks at that time of the land wars. So the greatest maritime disaster in New Zealand was the ship called the Orpheus, which was drowned there, or this ship sank there, and this occurred in 1863, and the ship was jam-packed full of British soldiers on their way to the frontier. So the Māori version of that story is that the taniwha, or the guardian within the ocean, cast his net and sunk this vessel. Yeah, thank you. So we're not all that tall in New Zealand. The shot's been gone askew somehow. But anyway, what was very important at this exhibition was the opening and the ceremony regarding the opening, and the coming together of my tribe of Tainui with the local tribe of Taranaki and reenacting these stories. So we have a ritual called the pōwhiri and the welcoming, and to people who are unfamiliar with it, it can seem quite hostile because, originally the purpose of this thing was for visitors. If they went into someone else's territory, there were very few ways of invading a fortification or a pa. So one way was to pretend that you were a friend, and then once you were in the safety of the pa, to then attack. So the pōwhiri was sort of this ritual that was a way of testing the intentions of your enemy. And even though it was a welcome, it was also a show of force, because if your enemy had intentions, they'd be so scared after the show of force that they would put those intentions aside. However, so anyway, this is the ritual of the pōwhiri, of the welcome. And so you had prominent people from Taranaki on one side, and then from our side. And then it was very important to recite whakapapa, or genealogy, that made all those connections and brought them forward. And at that pōwhiri, it was very important for Ruakere, or one of the main speakers for Taranaki, to talk about how the art gallery had been a cold place for them, and now it had been turned into this place of discussion, a whare kōrero, for them to tell their stories, or for us to tell these stories, that they were welcome again. Thanks, Mario. And so during the pōwhiri, we have they conduct this ceremony called the wairia, or the clearing. And so, you had haka, or dance, breaking out. You had pare haka, who are famous for their poi, which they're carrying in their hands. The woman carrying these poi, which are like balls, soft flex balls on a kind of string, which is used for performance, and the beating of the drum, which was introduced to pare haka after they were invaded, as a reference to the British and their marching coming forward to their village. So after that, when they perform these ceremonies, they have these drums which weren't used by Māori traditionally. So all of this transpired during the opening, which is very important. Thank you. Yeah, and then the presence of our tribe were very important. So this is Ngāti Koroki, my particular tribe, who all came for this event. And so the meeting of those two tribes was important to reinforce the dialogue. And this agreement, if you like, the statement, which is called the Kiwaya the Kete, and that's the idea that Taranaki, or the people that were our hosts, have one handles the kit or the basket, and we have another, that was spoken by King Tawhao, the second Māori king, after all the devastating effects of the land wars, and recognizing our common history in that regard. Thank you. So during the course of the exhibition, one of the major things that I was happy to see was the engagement and the level of engagement by this tribe of Taranaki. And so they had something called Te Riri me te Raukura, which means the anger and the symbol of peace, the Raukura, which is a feather, which is a symbol of peace adopted by prophets, Te Whiti and Tohu. So they had the series of events that commemorated their stories to do with the land wars and the taking of lands. And I was invited back to that, and the exhibition was very much part of that. Thanks, Maria. So there were ceremonies where they lit this massive fire at the day of the first invasion, and they'd hand out sticks for people from all the different tribes to add to the fire, and then recite their connections. Thank you. And then visiting those past sites or those fortifications, mighty fortifications where these battles had occurred. Thanks, Mario. And then there was a speaker series of some of the main leaders within Taranaki in response to the exhibition, but also bringing their stories to the gallery. Thank you. Oh, sorry. So one of those speakers was, sorry, yeah, you can go forward if you like. One of those speakers was Te Ingo, the fourth one in that image. Thanks, Mario. She's in the next image. And one of the features in the exhibition, I think, was there was Māori and English written on the walls explaining works, but Te Ingo had complete freedom to write a Māori response. So, quite often you go into these shows and their translations, and the poor Māori translator has to find words for that Mario knows well, avant-garde, abstract expressionism, postmodernism. They have to come up with Māori terms for these things. But she was given complete freedom to have her own interpretation, so that Māori speakers that went there would enjoy the poetry and the waiata, or all of the poetry and songs and chants that she was referring to, quite separate from the English text. Thank you. And so, yeah, the show was not without its controversy. So I don't know if you can read that, but ironically, they'd spent money on the exhibition, the council, and yet they refused to publicize it. So it was okay to publicize this exhibition to overseas or, art magazines and the rest of it, but it was not okay for the gallery to publish this exhibition within Taranaki itself, because they were afraid of the response by all the kind of redneck farmers and so on. Yeah, thank you. So this was a statement from that press release or story that came out. So it's quite ironic. The gallery sort of prides itself on its avant-garde nature, and the fact that they have all this cutting-edge artwork from prominent artists from overseas who conduct residencies at the art gallery. But if you're doing work that's so avant-garde that no one can relate to it, and you've got an audience of 3, it's fine. But if you're doing work that's controversial, hard-hitting, and directly responds to the history of the area, they had a great deal of difficulty with that. Thanks, Mario. Yeah, so thanks for listening. That's yeah, taimoana tai tangata, again in reference to the idea ka pare te taimoana, ka timu te tai tangata. When the ocean tide rises, the tide of humanity recedes. The idea that the past, present, and future are actually an indigenous perspective of looking at time, and that all of those things coincide. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brett. I think that this gives us plenty to talk about in the following session. For those of you who are joining us over Facebook, this is part of our summer institute, and so did he just go off? I'm sorry. So I'll just this is part of our summer institute, and so directly after this, Brett is generous enough to be able to join in a conversation with our students, who will be addressing a lot of the issues, some of them having to do with, although you're
in and out for some reason. I don't know if you hear me, but you know, even though you are coy about terms like avant-garde, postmodernism, and all that, there's definitely a term, contemporary Maori art, which you know, Brett is very much a part of, and I'm indebted to Dr. Anna Marie White for her dissertation, which frames Dr. Cram's work in a very provocative way, and so I'm hoping that we can sort of tease some of those issues out. You know, not only talk about contemporary Maori art, but also notions like contemporary taonga, and you know, even though there may not be maybe a notion of a future, or a future without looking back at the past, there must be an edge to the present that we can talk about that may be something like an avant-garde. But anyway, thank you all so very much. Please join us tomorrow at the same time when we will host Ryan Feddersen for this same spot. So thank you all very much.